"You don't belong here." The voice cut through the air of the quiet store like a sharp wind on a still morning. Darnell Williams stepped through the sliding glass doors, the faint scent of fresh paint and polished wood greeting him, but he didn't flinch. Dressed in a simple gray hoodie, dark jeans, and low-top sneakers, he carried nothing more than a plain leather notebook in one hand. The employees behind the counter glanced up briefly, then returned to their tasks, their eyes lingering on him with a mixture of suspicion and subtle judgment. He paused just inside the entrance, taking in the rows of shelves, the neatly stacked merchandise, and the customers moving between aisles, oblivious to the quiet storm about to unfold. He spotted the janitor by the far end of the store, his shoulders hunched, head bowed low as silent tears streaked down his cheeks. Darnell's eyes softened briefly, remembering the first time he had walked into a retail space as a young man, full of ambition and met with the same dismissive stares, the same quiet disbelief that someone who looked like him could belong here. He moved slowly, deliberately, every step measured, drawing no attention to the weight of his presence. The soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant chatter of customers contrasted sharply with the tension vibrating subtly in the air, a tension he could feel pressing against the walls as if the store itself were holding its breath. As he approached the janitor, he caught snippets of whispered commentary from the staff, remarks about dress, demeanor, and a thinly veiled disbelief that anyone could carry authority without flashing wealth or status symbols. Darnell's gaze swept the room, noting who avoided eye contact, who lingered just a little too long in judgment, and who hesitated to step forward even as the janitor's quiet anguish became impossible to ignore. He knelt slightly to meet the janitor's gaze, offering nothing but a calm, steady presence, and the man's eyes widened slightly, recognizing the subtlety of support before the confusion of his own emotions could take hold. Darnell's mind wandered briefly to the countless situations he had observed, experienced, and anticipated, the countless microaggressions that layered themselves invisibly in environments where power and skin color collided. He let the silence stretch for a moment, a deliberate pause that held the room captive, allowing the weight of the unspoken to settle, letting the employees and customers alike feel the gravity without a single raised voice. Then, as he stood, his movement smooth and unassuming, he spoke softly but clearly, not at the janitor, not at the staff, but at the store itself, as if declaring a quiet challenge to the invisible rules that had long governed this space. "Let's see who truly belongs." His words hung in the air, measured, precise, and yet heavy with promise, setting the stage for the subtle unraveling that was about to expose hidden truths, biases, and the quiet resilience that had carried him to this moment. Every heartbeat, every glance, every hesitation meticulously observed, cataloged, and understood in a way that only someone who had walked in the shadows of disbelief could comprehend. And in that stillness, the store seemed to lean forward, waiting for the inevitable revelation that Darnell Williams, in his understated presence, was about to command with a quiet authority that demanded attention. As Darnell Williams walked further into the store, he kept his gaze low, careful not to draw attention to the subtle weight of his presence, yet every movement was precise, deliberate, and intentional. The janitor continued to work, his movements slow and heavy, wiping the floors with a rhythm that betrayed exhaustion and silent frustration, but Darnell could feel the tension that radiated from him, the weight of unspoken stories and the pressure of being overlooked day after day. Customers shuffled past, unaware of the quiet drama unfolding around them, their conversations blending into the soft background hum of fluorescent lights and the faint whirring of the air conditioning vents. Behind the counter, employees whispered quietly to each other, glances darting towards Darnell, eyes narrowing slightly, some lips pursed as if they could sense the unfamiliar authority lingering without form or announcement. He moved towards the center aisle, letting his steps be measured, the soft sound of sneakers against the polished tile the only indicator of his progress. And as he did, he observed the patterns of interaction, the hesitations, the sideways glances, the small gestures that revealed the invisible hierarchies that had gone unquestioned for years. A young cashier near the front, blonde hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, fiddled nervously with a price scanner, her eyes flicking toward Darnell before quickly returning to the task at hand, a half-formed frown of disapproval etched across her face. A stock clerk in the back row shifted from foot to foot, leaning slightly to see the janitor, and then back to Darnell, a silent question lingering unspoken. Who was this man who moved with such calm and authority, yet carried no outward symbol of wealth or rank? The janitor paused mid-motion, mop suspended above the floor, catching Darnell's eye for a fleeting moment, a spark of recognition that went beyond words. Darnell nodded ever so slightly, acknowledging the shared understanding, a subtle bridge built in silence, the kind that only those who had endured similar dismissals could comprehend. In that moment, the store felt suspended, a quiet tension woven through the air like a taut wire waiting to vibrate. He let his eyes linger on the shelves, the neatly arranged merchandise, the subtle disarray of carts pushed slightly off-kilter, noting the small inefficiencies that revealed the human element within the organized environment. He watched as a customer approached the counter with a question about a product, the cashier responding quickly, but with a slight edge of impatience that spoke volumes about the undercurrents of stress and judgment that had become routine. Darnell's mind wandered briefly to the countless times he had navigated similar spaces, the microaggressions and subtle exclusions that built walls around him invisibly, walls that others failed to notice because they were constructed slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly. He drew a slow breath, allowing the subtle hum of the store to settle around him. And then he continued his measured path, approaching the janitor's aisle, moving past displays and signage without drawing unnecessary attention, every motion precise, yet understated, an exercise in quiet observation. As he reached the end of the aisle, he stood near the janitor without interrupting his work, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them, the weight of the unspoken truths filling the space. He could sense the energy shifting slightly, the air denser, as if the store itself had recognized the presence of someone who carried unacknowledged authority. Darnell's gaze moved subtly to the employees in the vicinity, noting their slight stiffening, their glances that darted quickly away, their hands that moved with the sudden carefulness of those caught on the threshold of doing something they had never been asked to reconsider. In that moment, the quiet presence of Darnell Williams became a lens through which the entire store was seen differently, and even as he said nothing, the tension, the anticipation, and the unspoken questions hung in the air, waiting for the subtle first move that would begin to unravel the assumptions and reveal the truths that had been hidden in plain sight for too long. Each footstep, each glance, each small pause carried weight, and the janitor, sensing the subtle change, allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible breath of relief, a shift in posture that acknowledged the quiet recognition of shared understanding. Darnell knew the moment was delicate, that the revelation would need to be measured, precise, and impactful, and so he continued forward, the soft leather of his notebook brushing against his side, a silent reminder of both his presence and his purpose, the quiet authority he carried without embellishment or ostentation. And as he moved through the central aisle, the store seemed to exhale slightly, the subtle vibrations of awareness threading through the employees, customers, and even the janitor, all caught in the gravity of a presence that had yet to announce itself fully but was already altering the dynamics of the space. The tension in the store continued to build with every subtle shift in posture, every exchanged glance, and every quiet murmur that passed between employees and customers alike. Darnell Williams moved slowly, each step deliberate, his presence commanding a silent awareness without a word, as if the store itself had adjusted to his rhythm. The janitor paused, mop suspended above the polished tile, and glanced at Darnell, a flicker of hope crossing his face, fragile yet undeniable. In the back aisle, a stock clerk straightened slightly, his shoulders no longer slumped with the casual indifference he had worn before, and the cashier at the register stopped mid-scan, eyes flicking up with curiosity and the faintest hint of recognition, though the realization of who Darnell was had not yet occurred. Whispers rose quietly among the staff, low enough that the customers barely noticed, but Darnell caught every nuance, noting the shift in tone and the slight trembling of a hand holding a clipboard, the tightening of a jaw as a young sales associate adjusted her ponytail nervously. He continued past a display of neatly arranged products, observing the subtle microaggressions that had become almost invisible in daily routine. A sigh at a customer's request, an impatient glance at a colleague, the slight hesitation in answering questions about stock availability. Each small gesture was a thread in the web of behavior shaped by long-standing assumptions, and Darnell cataloged it all silently, every detail a clue to the unseen pressures that governed this environment. As he approached the central aisle, the janitor's movement became more deliberate, a small measure of confidence seeping in, and Darnell offered a faint nod, acknowledging the unspoken connection between them, a silent promise that he was here to witness, understand, and eventually correct. A customer near the front, a young woman holding a basket of items, paused mid-step and glanced curiously at Darnell, sensing the difference in energy, the quiet authority that seemed to emanate from him, without any outward sign of power or wealth. Behind the counter, the whispering continued, some voices rising in tension, some fading in confusion, each one a small indicator of the growing awareness that this was no ordinary visitor. Darnell's eyes swept across the room, noting the alignment of employees in relation to the janitor, the subtle patterns of avoidance, and the micro-gestures that betrayed discomfort and unacknowledged respect. He allowed himself a brief mental pause, reflecting on the moments from his past when he had been in similar spaces, judged by appearance, dismissed despite qualifications, and observed silently how authority could be perceived as something external when it was in fact internal and deliberate. He walked past the shelves with a steady rhythm, neither hurried nor slow, maintaining an even gaze, and yet every motion carried a subtle message. The space belonged to him, the energy in the room now bending gently to his measured observation. Customers moved about, some oblivious, others sensing the undercurrent, and the janitor's head lifted slightly, a quiet acknowledgement of the unseen ally standing among the aisles. Darnell paused for a moment in the center of the store, allowing his presence to resonate. Noticing a young clerk reaching for a price tag and hesitating, her attention caught between routine and the shifting atmosphere. He observed a customer near the back, a man with a basket full of items, looking around curiously, perhaps sensing that the day would unfold differently than expected. Every glance, every pause, every whispered exchange was a note in the symphony of awareness he was conducting, a careful orchestration of observation that allowed the truth to surface naturally. The store, once a place of routine and habitual oversight, now felt charged, the undercurrent of tension rising as Darnell continued to move with deliberate calm, signaling without words that the normal patterns of behavior were about to be challenged. In that quiet authority, the janitor straightened a little, the cashier softened her hurried movements, and even the stock clerk hesitated in mid-step, all sensing a presence that was both subtle and commanding, the kind that did not announce itself with volume, but carried weight through awareness and observation alone. Darnell's notebook brushed lightly against his side, a silent reminder of his purpose, of the careful cataloging of actions and behaviors that would inform the unfolding of what needed to be addressed. As he reached the center of the store, near the checkout area, he paused again, allowing a deep, even breath to settle, noticing that the small details, the slight tightening of a wrist, the conscious adjustment of posture, the unintentional stutter in speech, were all indicators that the assumptions and unspoken hierarchies were beginning to shift, that his presence, quiet yet deliberate, was already prompting reflection, hesitation, and the first inklings of accountability in the employees around him. The janitor allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible straightening, the hint of a relief that someone capable and aware had noticed, that the quiet observation carried the weight of authority without overt display, and Darnell continued his careful pacing through the central aisle, each step measured, each glance considered, knowing that the stage was set, that the initial wave of tension and recognition had begun, and that soon the unfolding of truth and authority would transform the dynamics of the store from invisible pressures to acknowledged responsibility, all without a single raised voice, all through the silent weight of presence, awareness, and meticulous observation. A subtle shift occurred as Darnell Williams reached the back of the store, near the cleaning supply shelves, and the janitor glanced up again, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and tentative relief. The soft hum of the air conditioning seemed louder in that moment, carrying with it the faint rustle of shopping bags, the distant murmur of customers asking questions, and the almost imperceptible shuffle of employees adjusting their posture under the invisible weight of the room. Darnell did not speak immediately. Instead, he allowed a quiet pause, letting the gravity of his presence sink in, observing how each employee reacted, noting the minute gestures, the tightening of a jaw, a hand brushing nervously against a counter, a subtle backward step as if anticipating a revelation. He took another deliberate step, closing the distance between himself and the janitor, who lowered the mop slowly, his movements tentative, careful not to disrupt the rhythm of the polished floor beneath him, yet unable to hide the tension coiled in his shoulders. A young cashier at the front, a man with dark hair and glasses, whispered softly to a colleague, his voice barely audible, "Is that him?" And the colleague's eyes darted towards Darnell, then quickly down to the register, uncertain how to respond. Darnell's gaze swept across the store, making note of who hesitated, who lingered in expectation, and who avoided eye contact, each reaction a reflection of their assumptions, their perceptions of authority, and their understanding of the social dynamics that had long governed this space. He paused, allowing the janitor a moment to regain composure, noticing the slight relaxation of the shoulders, the deep breath that seemed to release a fraction of the anxiety. Then, softly, Darnell spoke, his voice calm, yet carrying an unspoken weight. "I have been watching quietly for a long time. I see what has been happening here." The words were directed to no one in particular, yet every employee felt the resonance, the subtle command carried in the measured cadence, the authority embedded in quiet observation. A customer at the side aisle, a woman in her mid-30s with a shopping basket half full of items, froze mid-step, sensing the tension and the unusual focus that seemed to anchor the entire room. And even she felt a shift in perspective, the ordinary mundane interaction now imbued with a deeper awareness of the unseen layers of control, responsibility, and observation. Darnell moved again, each step precise, approaching the center of the store where the aisles converged, his attention scanning the patterns of behavior, the way the employees interacted with each other, the way the janitor moved silently, yet carried the weight of overlooked labor, the subtle signs of stress, doubt, and unacknowledged respect. He noted a clerk leaning too far over a counter to avoid eye contact, a young stock assistant straightening his uniform, a cashier lifting a receipt printer lever slowly, as if testing the space and the air for response. Each movement was a note in a growing symphony of awareness, a careful orchestration of attention that had the effect of altering the room without a single overt command. The janitor, standing now with a slight straightening of his back, allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, recognizing in Darnell the presence of someone who understood the unspoken, someone who had once navigated similar spaces, felt the sting of doubt and dismissal, and had arrived here fully prepared to witness and to act with authority. Darnell's gaze returned to the employees, noting the subtle shifts, the micro-gestures that betrayed both tension and the faint beginnings of comprehension, and he allowed himself a slow, deliberate exhale, a minor release of the quiet pressure he maintained, signaling that he was present, attentive, and in command without needing to assert volume or theatrics. He began to move through the central aisle with measured steps, observing each small interaction, cataloging every nuance, letting the room feel the unspoken weight of accountability and observation. The subtle energy change was evident. The employees paused longer in their movements. A customer stopped to glance curiously at the unfolding tension, and the janitor's posture softened fractionally, no longer bowed under the invisible weight. Darnell's calm authority created a silent ripple through the store, and the anticipation of acknowledgement, of an eventual revelation, hung in the air, thick yet controlled, each heartbeat, each glance, each micro-expression carefully noted, as he prepared the stage for the turning point that would expose the unspoken truths and invite recognition, accountability, and the first step toward justice. The janitor's eyes were fixed on the floor, shoulders slightly trembling, yet there was a faint glimmer of relief in his gaze as Darnell Williams stood nearby, radiating quiet control over the situation. The hum of the store felt heavier now, each footstep, each movement magnified in the charged atmosphere, the soft squeak of the mop against the tile punctuating the silence with deliberate rhythm. Darnell allowed himself a slow, measured sweep of the room, taking in the subtle microaggressions that had been shaping behavior for months, perhaps years. A cashier carefully avoiding the gaze of a customer she assumed was too insignificant to merit attention, a stock clerk whispering under his breath as he adjusted products on the shelves, and the way a few customers unconsciously shifted in their paths, sensing that something unseen was affecting the energy in the space. Darnell's voice broke the near silence gently, carrying neither anger nor reprimand, yet every word held weight. "I see the strain you have been under," he said softly, glancing toward the janitor, whose hands gripped the mop with a slightly less rigid tension. "I see how unnoticed work and small slights accumulate into the daily burden that has become normal." The words floated in the aisle, catching the attention of employees and a few nearby customers, a delicate ripple spreading through the room, an acknowledgement of truth without accusation. The young cashier blinked rapidly, realizing for the first time that the person observing the room with such calm was more than a typical customer. Darnell stepped a few feet closer, the soft leather of his notebook brushing against his side, a reminder of the meticulous documentation he maintained and the employee's instinctively adjusted posture, unconsciously taking stock of who he might be and what authority he carried that was invisible to the eye. As he approached the janitor, he allowed a small pause, letting the silence linger, the kind that draws attention to every minor gesture, every subtle reaction. The janitor hesitated, then allowed a shallow nod, almost imperceptible, a sign of recognition that this presence was different, that it carried understanding, empathy, and the quiet authority of experience. Darnell's mind briefly wandered to his own past, the small injustices endured in spaces where appearance dictated perceived value, moments of silent observation, judgment, and dismissal that had shaped him. He understood that the microaggressions observed here were not deliberate acts of malice, but were the product of long-standing assumptions and biases, and yet their impact was tangible and cumulative, affecting the janitor, the staff, and the customers in subtle but meaningful ways. He drew a slow, deliberate breath, the cool air of the store brushing against him, carrying with it the faint scent of cleaning solutions, polished wood, and fresh merchandise, grounding him in the moment while the tension continued to build. As he spoke again, the voice remained calm, controlled, deliberate. "This place has functioned under assumptions that need to be seen, understood, and corrected," he said, letting each word land gently but firmly. The stock clerk stopped mid-motion, placing a box of items down on the shelf with extra care, sensing that the quiet observation was more impactful than any spoken admonition could be. Customers shifted, some pausing to glance curiously at Darnell, sensing the significance without full comprehension, while the janitor straightened slightly, a small but meaningful gesture that communicated trust and tentative relief. Darnell allowed his gaze to sweep slowly across the room, taking in the reactions, the subtle shifts in energy, and the collective awareness that had begun to form. Every motion, every glance, every pause contributed to the unfolding realization that the dynamics of the space were changing. That observation alone was creating accountability. He lingered near the center aisle, standing quietly yet commandingly, noting the change in posture of employees who had once moved unconsciously through routine, the slight straightening of backs, the careful movements, and the increased attentiveness to those around them. The janitor allowed a quiet, almost imperceptible exhale, the small relief of acknowledgement, and Darnell noted it with a subtle nod, reinforcing without words that the silent observation had already begun to shift the narrative, preparing the room for the moment when the unspoken truths would finally be addressed, accountability made visible, and recognition brought to those whose contributions had been overlooked and whose presence had been dismissed. The atmosphere hung in delicate balance, charged yet controlled, anticipation building with each measured movement, and with the unspoken understanding that what was coming would not require force or volume, but the deliberate unveiling of hidden truths and the quiet assertion of rightful authority. The store itself a stage for awareness, recognition, and the beginning of change. The air in the store seemed to shift as Darnell Williams lifted his gaze and met the eyes of the employees who had been whispering, adjusting, and avoiding observation. He remained calm, every movement measured, every step deliberate, and yet his presence carried a silent authority that seemed to press gently but firmly upon the room. He pulled out his phone from his hoodie pocket, sliding the screen open with a quiet efficiency that contrasted with the rising tension around him, and he dialed a number he knew by heart, the motion unremarkable yet laden with intent. A soft click and a voice answered, crisp and immediate. His executive assistant, prepared and aware of the signals, ready to execute the steps that Darnell had practiced for situations exactly like this. He spoke with a quiet clarity, giving precise instructions without urgency, each word carefully chosen to set the system into motion without causing alarm, yet carrying the full weight of authority. The employees at the counters and the aisles paused, the whispers slowing, glances darting back and forth as they noticed the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in demeanor, the controlled focus that seemed to tighten the space around them. The janitor's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the recognition that the presence he had once only dared to imagine was now coordinating a deliberate response that encompassed the entire store. Darnell's eyes swept the room, noting every microexpression, a raised eyebrow, a slight frown, a tightening of lips, each reaction catalogued silently, each a signal in the orchestration he had designed. The faint chime of the phone's call connecting to a secure internal line added a subtle rhythm to the hum of the store, and Darnell continued moving, steps soft but precise, weaving between displays, past customers, past products, without disturbing their path, yet asserting control through awareness alone. The employees who had been in subtle discord now sensed a pattern forming, a framework of observation that would reveal the truth of the environment they had operated within, the microaggressions that had gone unchecked, the biases that had been invisible to them until this point. Darnell allowed a slow pause, letting the room absorb the quiet authority he radiated, allowing the janitor and other employees alike to register the intentionality behind each action, the deliberation behind each glance, the certainty behind the calmness. He gestured slightly with a hand, directing attention subtly to the areas where adjustments would be acknowledged, changes implemented, and systems activated without disrupting the flow of the store. The subtle ripple of awareness spread outward. The cashier straightened fully. The stock clerk adjusted the alignment of merchandise with extra care. The young customer browsing paused and noticed the subtle energy shift, a faint recognition that something significant was unfolding beyond ordinary routine. Darnell's voice carried softly but clearly as he addressed no one in particular, yet the weight of his words resonated throughout the aisles. The work, the diligence, the unseen effort has been noticed. The patterns of behavior, the assumptions, the judgments will be recognized and addressed. A hush followed, not of fear but of comprehension, as the employees and a few observant customers realized that the quiet orchestration of authority was in motion, that the system had been engaged, and that the subtle yet unmistakable steps toward accountability had begun. The janitor allowed a small, steadying breath, shoulders straightening fractionally, the hint of relief evident in his posture as he recognized the support and acknowledgement. Darnell's gaze continued to sweep across the store, cataloging reactions, noting shifts in energy, adjusting timing and focus, all with the silent efficiency of someone trained to command respect without raising a voice. He kept his movements fluid, observing, pausing when necessary, letting the employees, the janitor, and even the customers perceive the unfolding of a deliberate, controlled process that would lead to truth being recognized, biases being acknowledged, and authority being asserted in a manner both precise and dignified. Each step, each pause, each glance, each subtle gesture contributed to the construction of the moment where the hidden truths would be revealed, and the quiet orchestration of justice, respect, and awareness would be fully realized within the walls of the store, preparing the space for the inevitable moment when Darnell Williams would transition from silent observer to revealed authority, demonstrating that patience, presence, and careful strategy could command recognition and respect without force, volume, or theatrics, and that the unseen power of quiet action could reshape the dynamics of an entire environment with deliberate precision. The moment came as Darnell Williams paused in the center aisle, a quiet stillness settling over the store that seemed to make every sound more distinct, from the soft hum of the air conditioning to the faint rustle of merchandise and the gentle steps of customers moving through the space. He raised his head slightly, letting his gaze sweep across the employees, the janitor, and even the few attentive customers who had begun to sense that something significant was unfolding. Then, with deliberate clarity, he spoke, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "You called me a visitor, an outsider, a stranger in the space I built. You assumed I would be invisible, unimportant, or irrelevant." The words lingered, each syllable carefully measured, and the employees instinctively straightened, the whispered conversations dying mid-phrase as they realized that authority was now being claimed not through volume or theatrics, but through presence and truth. Darnell took another step forward, notebook at his side, eyes sweeping to meet the gaze of the janitor, whose posture had straightened slightly, a flicker of understanding passing between them, a quiet acknowledgement that the unseen hand of oversight had finally been recognized. He gestured subtly, with one hand, a small movement that carried the weight of command, and spoke again, this time addressing the room as a whole. "Every small action, every judgment, every assumption you have carried about who belongs here or does not has been observed, recorded, and considered." The atmosphere shifted further, a sense of awareness settling over the space like a wave, employees exchanging glances as the unspoken acknowledgement of their roles and actions became unavoidable. Darnell allowed a moment for the weight of the statement to permeate, then continued, "I am not here to chastise with anger. I am here to reveal the truth of what this store represents, what this environment tolerates, and what it overlooks." A hush fell over the room, not of fear, but of attention, the kind that fills a space with anticipation, where every microexpression, every gesture, every subtle shift of posture is noted and interpreted. The young cashier at the front, a man with neatly combed hair, pressed his hands lightly against the counter, sensing the gravity of the revelation without fully understanding its form, while the stock clerk paused mid-step, a box of merchandise held halfway as he tried to process the unspoken authority radiating through the room. The janitor exhaled softly, a quiet release that signaled recognition of Darnell's presence and the acknowledgement that the unseen, deliberate power in the room was now aligned with justice and understanding. Darnell's gaze moved carefully across each aisle, noting how employees shifted subtly in their positions, how a customer glanced up from a shopping cart, realizing that this was no ordinary interaction, and how even the air seemed to carry a charge, a quiet awareness of accountability settling over the space. Then, with precise calm, he stepped a little closer to the central area where the janitor had been working, voice steady and deliberate. "You assumed silence was submission. You assumed that absence of confrontation meant acceptance. You were wrong. Everything you have witnessed, every hesitation, every microreaction, every unspoken thought, has been recorded and will inform what comes next." The employees froze slightly, the subtle tightening of shoulders, the narrowing of eyes, and the careful folding of hands revealing the understanding that a moment of revelation was imminent. Darnell's eyes met those of the employees one by one, each connection quiet yet commanding, drawing attention not through volume but through presence, a recognition that the authority he wielded was not new, but had been cultivated through experience, observation, and deliberate intent. The janitor allowed himself a faint nod, subtle but meaningful, acknowledging both the recognition and the shift in dynamics that Darnell's calm assertion of presence had created. A soft murmur passed through the room, tentative but growing, as customers began to notice the gravity of the situation, their awareness heightened by the deliberate control Darnell maintained over the flow and attention of the space. Then he spoke again, slowly, with measured emphasis, each word designed to be absorbed fully. "I own this store. Every decision, every action, every protocol, and every policy that governs this space falls under my responsibility. The assumptions you made, the judgments you carried, and the microaggressions you thought invisible are no longer unseen." The employees and customers alike felt the shift, a quiet awe settling over the space as the hidden authority, once invisible and unacknowledged, became explicit, undeniable, and entirely present. The janitor straightened further, shoulders squared, the subtle tension in his posture replaced by the recognition that justice, awareness, and acknowledgement had arrived not through confrontation, but through deliberate observation and controlled revelation. Darnell paused, allowing the statement to resonate, then added softly but firmly, "You will carry this awareness forward. The truth has been revealed, and from this point, every action and decision will be informed by recognition, accountability, and understanding." The store seemed to hold its breath, each movement measured, each eye attentive, each heart acknowledging the quiet yet absolute presence of authority, preparing the space for the next phase of reckoning, the final unveiling of accountability and recognition that would redefine the environment entirely. The atmosphere in the store had shifted completely as Darnell Williams remained at the center aisle, silent yet commanding, each subtle gesture resonating through the room with a quiet authority that made every employee and customer conscious of their actions. The janitor, once hunched and withdrawn, now stood straighter, mop resting against the floor, eyes alert yet calm, understanding that the presence beside him was more than just observation. It was oversight, acknowledgement, and validation all in one. Employees along the counters and aisles stopped their whispered conversations, noticing the deliberate control in Darnell's stance, the measured pacing of his steps, the soft but unmistakable tone in his voice as he spoke to no one in particular, yet everyone heard him. The assumptions made here, the judgments carried silently, the microaggressions you believed were invisible, they are now recognized and recorded. Every action has consequences, and every decision will now reflect awareness and accountability. The soft clicking of his notebook as he adjusted it at his side punctuated the statement, a quiet auditory reminder of the deliberate documentation and planning behind every observation. Customers began to look around with heightened attention, sensing that the ordinary patterns of a retail experience were dissolving into a moment of reckoning, where observation, presence, and silent authority defined the environment more than words ever could. A young stock clerk straightened the boxes on the shelves, hands trembling slightly, realizing that the day's subtle mistakes, overlooked details, and unacknowledged behaviors had been noticed, not for reprimand, but for rectification, and that the moment of awareness carried a weight that demanded reflection. Darnell's gaze swept slowly across the room, resting briefly on each employee, registering posture, expression, microgestures, and the subtle signs of acknowledgement or hesitation, cataloging it all in the quiet space between words, ensuring that the room understood the gravity of the unfolding situation. He stepped closer to the center of the floor, closer to the janitor, whose shoulders had relaxed fractionally. A faint nod of understanding communicated through the stillness, a silent recognition that the oversight was not punitive but precise, structured, and purposeful. Darnell raised his voice slightly, calm and firm, each word deliberate and resonant. "You believed your actions went unnoticed. You believed silence indicated acceptance. Today, observation has replaced assumption, awareness has replaced ignorance, and accountability will replace oversight." The employees exchanged glances, the whispering ceased entirely, and even the customers recognized that the space had transformed, that the ordinary had become extraordinary through the silent assertion of authority. The janitor allowed himself a small, controlled breath, shoulders squared, hands relaxing from the mop, as if sensing that the weight of his unseen efforts was finally acknowledged. Darnell continued, voice measured, emphasizing without escalation. "This is not about shame or embarrassment. This is about recognition, about understanding, about bringing clarity to what has been ignored and unexamined for too long. Every individual in this space contributes to the story of this store, and now, the story will be told with accuracy, respect, and truth." Subtle movements spread across the employees, a clerk adjusting his tie, a cashier aligning her register. Items more carefully, a stock assistant checking the shelves with renewed focus, all reflecting the silent influence that Darnell's presence carried. Even customers began to lean slightly forward, curious, aware that the store was no longer just a place to shop, but a stage for recognition, awareness, and the unveiling of unseen truths. Darnell paused, letting the words and presence resonate fully, eyes locking briefly with each staff member, conveying the weight of accountability without force, without drama, just precision, observation, and authority. The janitor's posture relaxed further, the faintest smile crossing his lips, a reflection of relief and acknowledgement that the unseen work, the unnoticed diligence, had finally been recognized. Darnell's calm, steady presence had reshaped the room, made every micro-gesture visible, every action considered, and every assumption addressed, preparing the space for the final understanding, the irreversible acknowledgement that authority and awareness had been restored, that the store itself was now aligned with truth, recognition, and measured justice, and that the moment for the final statement of command and acknowledgement was imminent, ready to culminate in clarity, understanding, and the quiet satisfaction of justice observed and executed without noise or theatrics. Darnell Williams stood at the center of the store, calm and steady, the air around him charged with anticipation. Every employee and customer now fully aware that the ordinary had transformed into a moment of recognition and accountability. His eyes met each staff member's gaze in turn, lingering just long enough to communicate both authority and understanding, and the janitor, now standing upright, nodded subtly, feeling a quiet relief that his diligence and presence had been acknowledged at last. Darnell took a measured step forward, raising his voice slightly, calm, precise, and clear, resonating across the space. You questioned my presence, my intentions, my authority, and assumed ignorance where there was experience. Today, the assumptions end. Every action, every hesitation, every judgment, every glance has been seen, and every truth recognized. A hush fell over the room, a quiet collective intake of breath, as employees and customers alike absorbed the weight of his words, realizing that authority need not be loud or forceful to be absolute. The janitor allowed a subtle exhale, the small motion signaling both acknowledgement and relief, the burden of invisibility lifted in the presence of deliberate observation and quiet power. Darnell's gaze swept methodically across the store again, registering each small gesture, the alignment of merchandise, the subtle postures of employees, the way customers paused mid-step to sense the tension and awareness in the space. And he allowed a faint smile, the kind that conveyed both satisfaction and calm authority without theatrics. Then, with deliberate cadence, he continued, speaking for the entire room, the words measured and imbued with purpose. This store, this space, this environment, is a reflection of all who occupy it. Every assumption, every unconscious bias, every overlooked effort, every microinteraction is now visible, recognized, and accounted for. The work you do, the presence you bring, and the respect you extend, or fail to extend, will now carry weight. Today marks the turning point. The employees stiffened, some shifting subtly, understanding for the first time that the quiet observation they had witnessed was not passive but active, intentional, and transformative. Customers watched with curiosity and growing understanding, sensing that the unfolding moment carried significance beyond the ordinary retail experience. Darnell nodded once toward the janitor, whose posture had straightened fully, mop resting lightly against the floor, the faintest spark of pride visible in his eyes, and he allowed the acknowledgement to linger, letting the quiet power of presence speak for itself. He then extended his gaze across the employees, noting the careful adjustments in posture, the mindful attentiveness, the subtle tension replaced with awareness, and he spoke again, softly yet firmly. You assumed invisibility would remain unnoticed. You assumed that quiet effort and diligence could be dismissed without consequence. Today, the unseen is seen, the overlooked acknowledged, and the truth recognized. Your responsibility now matches your awareness, and the expectations are clear. A gentle murmur ran through the room, employees exchanging glances, some nodding, others pausing thoughtfully, all recognizing the implications of his statements. Darnell allowed a slow, deliberate breath to settle through the space, reinforcing the gravity of the moment without needing to raise his voice. And then he stepped slightly back, the subtle movement drawing the room's focus to his words and the authority embodied in the calm, measured stance. I did not raise my voice. I raised the standard, he said, the words clear, concise, and final, resonating through the store with a quiet force that commanded attention and respect, an assertion that carried the weight of experience, leadership, and accountability. The janitor straightened fully, shoulders relaxed, the tension of doubt dissipating, and the employees remained still, processing the moment, aware that the ordinary hierarchies had shifted, that recognition had been established, and that the environment now operated under new understanding and respect. Customers, too, felt the transformation, the ordinary visit now a witness to authority exercised with precision, dignity, and impact, the subtle but undeniable influence of someone who had navigated silence, observation, and oversight to ensure truth, recognition, and accountability prevailed. The store seemed to exhale collectively, a shared awareness settling across every aisle, every counter, every interaction, as Darnell Williams allowed a quiet moment of observation to complete the transformation, leaving the employees, the janitor, and the customers alike with a clear and unshakable understanding that presence, insight, and deliberate action could assert authority, correct injustice, and elevate standards without need for confrontation, volume, or spectacle. And in that stillness, the store, its people, and its environment had been irrevocably shifted toward clarity, respect, and truth.